This is my true story. I raised my son with every drop of love I had. From his first steps to his first job, I gave him everything. My money, my care, my time. But one afternoon, my mind slipped and I called him by the wrong name. Instead of laughing, he lost control. He struck me again and again, 15 times until the room went silent. That day, I understood what respect really means. I didn't fight back. I waited. And then I sold his house, the same house built with my hands, and disappeared forever. Before I tell you how, tell me where you're watching from. And please subscribe so my story reaches more hearts. From the day I gave birth to my son, my life had a purpose. I was young, unsure, and poor, but the moment I held him, I felt rich. His tiny cry was the first sound that made me believe I was worth something. I didn't know then that this same child, the one I would feed, teach, and love beyond measure, would one day raise his hand against me. Back then, all I could see was his face, small and soft, sleeping on my chest, while the world outside didn't matter. I built my life around his breath. I woke before sunrise every day to make him food, even when I had nothing for myself. I patched old clothes and turned them new for him. I smiled through hunger, through sickness, through storms, just to make sure he never saw my struggle. I used to whisper into his hair while he slept that he would become a kind man, a strong man, one who would never forget where he came from. That was my dream. Not wealth, not rest, not fame, just his goodness. When he was sick as a child, I sat beside his bed for nights without closing my eyes. I pressed wet cloths to his forehead when he burned with fever. I held his hand when he cried from pain. I never prayed for myself in those years. Every prayer was for him. I told God, take my strength, give it to him. And somehow it always worked. He would wake up the next morning smiling, asking for breakfast like nothing had happened. I didn't know that love could tire you and heal you at the same time. When my husband passed away early, I thought my world had ended. But my son became the reason I kept breathing. I promised myself I would be both father and mother for him. I worked harder than ever. I took any job that came my way, cleaning floors, washing dishes, ironing clothes for others. My hands cracked from soap and cold water, but I didn't complain. When people asked why I never rested, I always said, because my son is my future. I wore that line like armor. He grew fast, his shoes got bigger, his clothes tighter, his needs greater. I didn't mind. I cut my portions smaller so he could eat more. I walked to the market instead of taking the bus so I could save for his books. I stitched his school uniform by candlelight when the electricity was cut off. I remember the day he won his first prize, a small certificate for drawing. I pinned it to the wall as if it were gold. I told everyone I met, my boy will make me proud one day. Every time he smiled, I felt full again. Every time he called me Ma, I forgot the pain in my knees, the burn in my hands. I thought that love like this would last forever, that a bond built through years of struggle could never break. I believed that a child never forgets the arms that carried him through storms. When he became a teenager, things changed slowly. He spent more time with friends, less with me. I told myself it was normal. I waited for him at dinner, sometimes till late, keeping the food warm again and again. When he came home, he barely spoke. I asked about his day, and he shrugged. I smiled anyway. I thought, he's growing up. Boys become quiet. I didn't know then that silence was the beginning of distance. He grew into a man, taller, stronger, sharper. I used to look at him and feel proud, thinking, I made this, I raised this. But as his shoulders widened, so did the gap between us. He started telling me not to worry, not to wait up, not to ask questions. He moved through the house like a guest, and I stood in the background watching him drift away from the woman who had built his world. When he got married, I was both happy and scared. I thought, now he will have someone to love him like I did. I welcomed his wife with open arms, treating her like a daughter. I shared recipes, stories, memories, hoping she would see me as more than an old woman, as a mother. For a while, everything seemed peaceful. We ate together, celebrated festivals, shared laughter. I believed we had built a family again. But love has seasons. Slowly, things started to change. My son became quieter again. He spent more time outside, less time talking. His wife began making small comments about how I forgot things, how I misplaced keys, how I asked too many questions. I laughed it off at first, thinking she didn't mean harm, but her words grew sharper and he began to echo them. There were days when I felt like a stranger in my own home. I would walk into a room and their conversation would stop. I would ask something and they would exchange glances as if I were interrupting. I began staying in my room longer, eating after everyone else, trying not to be a burden. My body grew old, but my love didn't. Every morning I still prayed for him, still folded his clothes, still left food for him even when he forgot to eat. Sometimes my memory failed me. I would forget where I kept things, or I would mix up names in conversation. Age does that to you. It doesn't mean you've lost your mind. It means your mind has carried too many memories for too long. I remembered his first word, his first fever, his first heartbreak, but sometimes I would forget small things in the present. I thought he would understand. I thought he would laugh gently and say, "It's okay, Ma." But he didn't. He had grown impatient, busy, tired. I could see it in his eyes when I forgot something, his face hardened. When I made mistakes, his tone changed. And still I smiled. I told myself, he's stressed, it's not his fault. I covered his cruelty with excuses, just like I had covered his bruises with my hands when he was small. Every mother has a blind spot for her child. Mine was him. I refused to see how his heart had changed. I told myself he loved me, even when he shouted. I told myself he was kind, even when his words stung. Because the truth was too painful, that the boy I had raised with every ounce of my being was turning into someone I didn't recognize. And yet, I never stopped loving him. I would wait for him every night until I heard the door close. I would light a lamp and pray that he was safe. I would still fold his clothes neatly, still cook his favorite food, still tell myself that tomorrow would be different. I believed that love, no matter how one-sided, still had the power to heal. I didn't know then that love without respect becomes a rope that strangles you slowly. I didn't know that one day my love would be met not with silence, but with violence. When I look back now, I realize that every moment of care, every sleepless night, every small act of devotion was part of a lifetime I can never get back. I gave everything I had, believing it would come back to me in kindness. But kindness never came. Only cruelty did. Still, if I could go back, I would do it again, because that's what mothers do. We love, even when love hurts. We give, even when we're empty. We hold on, even when the hands we hold start to push us away. That was my life. A lifetime of love, given without conditions, without limits, without realizing it would one day cost me everything. The change didn't come suddenly. It came quietly, like a slow fog creeping into a familiar room. At first, I didn't notice it. Or maybe I didn't want to. My son's tone became shorter, his patience thinner, his eyes colder. But I told myself it was stress, that everyone changes as they grow. I excused his distance with the same love that once excused his mistakes as a boy. When he came home late without saying where he was, I waited up for him. When he forgot to call for days, I told myself he was busy. I clung to explanations because the truth was too painful, that maybe I was no longer the center of his world. He had started to pull away in small, almost invisible ways. He began locking his bedroom door, something he had never done before. I told myself he valued privacy, not that he was shutting me out. He would eat in silence, scrolling on his phone, nodding absent-mindedly when I spoke. I used to share stories about the old days, about his father, about how we built this life together, but soon he stopped responding. His silence felt like a wall. Still, I kept talking, hoping my words would climb over it. They didn't. I noticed how he began to correct me more often, about names, about times, about things I forgot. He would sigh when I repeated myself. I told myself it was normal, that old people forget things and young ones get impatient. But each sigh chipped away at something inside me. Each look of irritation felt like a reminder that I was no longer needed, no longer important. He stopped asking for my advice, stopped telling me about his work, stopped sitting beside me during meals. I became the background noise in the home I once filled with laughter. When I tried to talk to him about small things, his answers were short. Yes. No. Later. That word, later, became the knife that cut through every moment I tried to hold on to. Later never came. He was always busy, always elsewhere, even when sitting right in front of me. I thought maybe marriage had changed him, that he was balancing too much, that time would bring him back. But time only took him further. His wife, too, began to look at me differently. At first, she called me Ma, with affection. Later, she just said my name, as if I were a guest, not family. She started correcting me for small mistakes, how I folded the clothes, how I added too much salt, how I forgot to switch off the light. Her voice was polite, but her eyes were not. They carried judgment, quiet, and sharp. And when I turned to my son for support, he said nothing. His silence became her permission. I began to stay in my room more. I didn't want to irritate anyone. I stopped humming while I cooked, stopped telling stories, stopped asking questions. The house grew quieter, and so did I. Sometimes I could hear them laughing in the other room, and for a moment I felt happy that they were happy. But when I heard my name mentioned, the laughter would stop. That silence after my name felt like a knife, too. I started to forget small things more often, where I kept my glasses, what day it was, whether I had locked the gate. My mind had carried too much for too long. Sometimes it slipped. I thought they would understand. Instead, I saw annoyance in their eyes. My son would scold me lightly, his wife would roll her eyes, and I would apologize even when I didn't know what for. I told myself it was age. I told myself I needed to be more careful, but inside, a quiet sadness began to grow. Once I overheard them talking. They didn't know I was standing near the door. She said, "She's becoming forgetful. What if she messes something up?" And he replied, "I know. It's stressful." My heart broke hearing that word, stressful. I had once been his comfort, his strength, the one person who made his life easier. Now I was a problem. I covered my mouth and walked back to my room before they could see the tears. I started writing notes to myself so I wouldn't forget things. I labeled containers in the kitchen. I set reminders on the clock. I even tied a small ribbon around my wrist to remember to take my medicine. I was doing everything to make their life easier, but no one noticed. My effort had become invisible. Love, when unacknowledged, begins to fade like an old photograph. Then came the day I realized I was no longer welcome in certain spaces of the house. His study, their bedroom, even the living room sometimes. I would walk in and feel the air change. Their conversations would stop, their smiles would vanish. I would stand there for a second, pretending I had forgotten something, then quietly walk out. I had lived my whole life in this house, but now every room felt borrowed. The small slights became routine. He started to sigh when I asked him to repeat something. He stopped saying good morning. He began spending weekends out, sometimes without telling me. His wife no longer left a plate for me at dinner. I had to take my own food after they finished. I told myself it was fine. I told myself I was still lucky to have a roof, still lucky to see him every day, but gratitude can become a chain when you start thanking people for what should be yours by right. I tried to bring back old habits. I baked his favorite sweets, hoping the smell would remind him of his childhood. But when he came home, he didn't even notice. I left a bowl on the table, and the next morning it was still there, untouched. That's when I realized I was trying to feed a memory that no longer existed. There were days when I forgot things that mattered. Birthdays, bills, sometimes names. It wasn't serious, just slips of an aging mind. But his reaction to those moments started to scare me. He would glare, his jaw tightening, his tone sharp. He would talk to me like I was a child, and every time I would shrink a little more. It was as if he couldn't see the woman who raised him anymore. He saw only an old woman who made mistakes. I began to think maybe I truly was the problem. Maybe I had stayed too long, spoken too much, loved too loudly. Maybe the best thing I could do was to stay quiet, stay out of the way. But even that didn't help. My silence annoyed him too. He would ask, "Why are you sitting there doing nothing?" And I would smile weakly, not knowing what to say. Everything I did was wrong. When I spoke, when I stayed quiet, when I forgot, when I remembered. The home that once felt warm now felt cold, like a place where laughter was replaced with waiting. I spent hours staring at the garden, watching the leaves move in the wind. They looked free. I wasn't. I was trapped inside walls I had built with my own hands, living among people who no longer saw me. Sometimes I thought about leaving, just packing a small bag and going somewhere quiet. But then I would remember his face as a child, the way he used to call me Ma with love, the way he clung to me when thunder scared him. That memory always stopped me. Love is strange that way. It ties you to people even when they hurt you. Still, I could feel something inside me starting to shift. It wasn't anger yet, not even resentment, just a quiet awareness that love should not hurt like this. A small voice in my heart whispered that one day something would break. I didn't know then that it would come with 15 slaps and silence that would last forever. But before that storm, there were these cracks, small, quiet, almost invisible, the kind that grow slowly, the kind that no one sees until the whole wall falls apart. It was an ordinary afternoon that began quietly, with the kind of peace that fools you before a storm. The sunlight came through the curtains softly. I was sitting on the chair near the window, knitting something I had been working on for weeks. The house was quiet except for the ticking clock. It was one of those moments when everything feels still. The air, the thoughts, even time itself. I remember thinking that I should start preparing dinner soon. My son was home, resting in his room after work. Life had been heavy lately, but I still believed that calmness could heal what words could not. I had no idea that before the day ended, that calm would turn into chaos. I had gone into the kitchen to make tea. The air smelled of ginger and cardamom. I poured the tea into 2 cups, one for him, one for me. My hands trembled slightly, as they often did now. I placed his cup on the table near the living room, and as I called out to him, my mind faltered. For a moment, just a fleeting second, I forgot his name. It wasn't that I didn't know who he was. I had carried him inside me for 9 months, held him for decades. I simply said the wrong name. Maybe I called him by his father's name, maybe by someone from long ago. I can't remember now. It was a tiny slip, a simple mistake that any aging mind could make, but that moment changed everything. He walked into the room with an expression I hadn't seen before. Anger so sharp it didn't look human. His eyes were wide, his breath fast. Before I could even realize what I had done, his hand struck my face. The sound filled the room like thunder. My body froze. I tried to understand what had happened. I thought maybe it was a reflex, maybe he hadn't meant it, but then it happened again. And again. The first few slaps were loud, the next ones were quiet, muffled by shock. I stopped counting after the 10th, but later I remembered them all. 15 slaps. 15 strikes of disbelief, 15 reminders that the boy I raised with love had turned into a stranger I didn't know. Each one landed not just on my skin, but on the memories that built him. The pain didn't come all at once. It came in waves. I could taste blood in my mouth. My ears rang, my vision blurred. But more than the pain, it was the look in his eyes that broke me. Not rage, but disgust. As if my mistake had erased everything I'd ever done for him. As if in that small slip of memory, I had lost the right to be his mother. He shouted something I couldn't process. His words blurred into noise. I just stood there, my face burning, my heart cracking, my mind trying to find a reason. I had known anger before, but not like this. Not from him, not for something so small, so human. My hands shook as I reached for the edge of the table to steady myself. The teacup I had placed for him toppled and shattered on the floor. The tea spread across the tiles, mixing with the drops of blood from my lip. He stood there, chest heaving, his hand still trembling. I waited for him to stop, for him to realize what he had done, for even a flicker of guilt to appear on his face. But it didn't. He turned away, muttering something under his breath, and walked out of the room. I could hear the sound of his steps moving down the hall, firm, uncaring, final. The door to his room shut hard, and the house went silent again. I stood still for a long time. I didn't cry. I didn't move. I couldn't. My body had stopped listening to me. My cheek throbbed. My heart pounded, but my mind was blank. I could still hear the echo of his palm against my skin, each one louder than the last. I had been hit before by life, by poverty, by loss, by loneliness, but never by the child I raised. That kind of pain doesn't sting, it hollows. When I finally sat down, the chair creaked beneath me, the same chair I'd used to rock him to sleep when he was a baby. I looked at my hands. They were shaking. These were the same hands that had fed him, washed him, carried him when he couldn't walk, wiped his tears when he was scared. Now they trembled not from weakness, but from disbelief. I touched my face gently. My skin felt hot and swollen. I could feel the shape of his fingers on my cheek. I whispered to myself not to blame him, but to stay calm. That's what mothers do. We explain away even the worst things our children do. But this time, no explanation came. There was no way to make sense of it. I had made a small mistake, a slip of the tongue, and for that he had struck me 15 times. What could justify that? I looked at the broken cup on the floor and thought about how fragile everything is. Not just glass, but love. One mistake and it shatters. And once it breaks, no matter how much you try, it never looks the same again. Later, I went to the bathroom to wash my face. I looked in the mirror and didn't recognize myself. My cheek was red and swollen. My lip was bleeding slightly. But it wasn't the bruises that frightened me. It was my eyes. They looked empty. There was no anger in them, no tears, no fight, just a deep, quiet sadness that I had never seen before, the kind that only comes when love dies. When his wife came home later, she saw me and looked away. She didn't ask what happened. Maybe she already knew. Maybe she had heard the shouting. Her silence told me everything. That in this house, even violence was normal now. That I was alone, that no one would stand up for me. That night, I lay in bed with my face turned to the wall. I didn't sleep. I didn't pray. I just listened. To the silence, to my heartbeat, to the ghosts of everything I had done for him. I thought of the time I had carried him through the rain because he was too tired to walk. I thought of the nights I skipped meals so he could eat. I thought of how many times I had forgiven his harsh words before, but now there was nothing left to forgive. This wasn't anger. This was something deeper, a complete loss of humanity. I realized then that something inside me had broken beyond repair. I had loved him more than I had loved myself, and in return, he had taught me what it felt like to be nothing. But in that emptiness, something else began to grow. Not hate, not vengeance, but clarity. I knew then that I could not stay, that I could not spend another day under the same roof where my blood had fallen to the floor. The pain in my body faded after a few hours, but the pain in my soul stayed. Every heartbeat echoed like a reminder. 15 times he had chosen anger over love. 15 times he had reminded me that the bond between us had died long before that slap. I didn't cry until the morning. When sunlight hit the wall, I finally let the tears fall. Not for him, but for myself, for the years I had wasted believing that love alone was enough to protect me. I realized that kindness without respect is a curse, that silence in the face of cruelty is surrender. That day, I stopped being the mother who tolerated everything. I became the woman who would take everything back. I didn't know how yet. I didn't have a plan. But as I wiped my tears and looked around the room, at the walls I had painted, the curtains I had stitched, the house that carried my name, I knew one thing with certainty. He might have raised his hand on me, but this house, this life, still belonged to me. And one day soon I would remind him of that truth. The day after I visited the lawyer, everything inside the house looked the same, but I was not the same woman anymore. My son still moved through the rooms with that same careless pride, believing he owned everything his eyes could see. His wife still gave me that practiced smile that hid more judgment than warmth. But I no longer saw them as people I owed anything to. I saw them as strangers occupying what was mine. The bruises on my face were fading, but the marks inside me had already turned into a new kind of power. Quiet, steady, unstoppable. I started moving differently, speaking less, observing more. Silence became my shield. I cooked their meals as usual, cleaned the rooms, watered the plants. I did everything I always did, but my thoughts were elsewhere. I had a plan now, a plan that didn't need noise or witnesses, a plan that wouldn't shout for attention, but would leave its mark in silence. Each day when they left for work, I opened my cupboard and looked at the envelope holding the new documents. My name on those papers looked stronger than any word my son could ever say to me. I would trace my fingers over the ink and remind myself that this was my proof, my freedom written in lines and seals. I wasn't afraid anymore. I was patient. I started to prepare quietly for what came next. I began gathering the things that truly belonged to me, my jewelry, my old photographs, a few clothes, and the little bit of cash I had saved over the years. I wrapped them carefully in a small cloth bag, folding everything neatly as if I were packing pieces of my own soul. I didn't need much. I wasn't planning to take a life's worth of things, only what still held meaning. During the days, I went about life as if nothing had changed, but inside, I was building distance, emotional, mental, and physical. I no longer asked my son where he was going. I no longer waited for him to come home. I stopped cooking his favorite dishes. I stopped leaving his clothes neatly folded. It wasn't revenge. It was preparation. Every small act of withdrawal was me taking myself back. When he and his wife started noticing my silence, they became uneasy. They asked if I was feeling sick. I said no. They asked if something was wrong. I said nothing. My silence unsettled them because for years I had been the one to keep everything smooth, soft, forgiving. Without my voice, the house grew colder. Without my care, the comfort began to fade. They didn't know it, but the foundation of that home had always been me. I spent my evenings sitting by the window thinking about all the years I had spent bending, pleasing, enduring. I thought about the young girl I used to be, strong, hopeful, dreaming of a peaceful family. Somewhere along the line, that girl had disappeared. I had become a mother, then a caregiver, then an afterthought. But now, as I looked at the papers again and again, I realized that the girl was still alive, waiting for me to remember her. One afternoon, I called the lawyer again to confirm the transfer. My voice was calm and polite, but my heart was beating fast. He told me everything had gone through successfully. The property now belonged solely to me. No joint rights, no shared claim. It was final. The words felt like air after drowning. I thanked him softly, hung up the phone, and sat still for a long while. My eyes filled with quiet tears, not of pain, but of relief. That night, I made dinner as usual. My son sat at the table, scrolling through his phone. His wife spoke about some party they were planning. I listened in silence, nodding when expected. None of them noticed the papers in my cupboard, freshly stamped, signed, sealed, the silent truth that everything around them was no longer theirs. When they went to bed, I walked around the house one last time, room by room. I touched the walls, the furniture, the pictures on the wall. I thought about all the moments this home had seen: birthdays, laughter, tears, arguments, and love. It had been built from my hands, and soon it would become my freedom. I whispered a small goodbye to each corner, not out of sadness, but gratitude. The next morning, I went to the bank and withdrew some money. Not all of it, just enough for what I needed next. The teller looked at me and asked if I wanted to close the account. I smiled faintly and said no. Some ties you cut slowly. Back home, I started sorting through documents and photos. I tore up old bills, letters, and receipts, anything that tied me to a life that was now gone. I only kept what mattered: my identity papers, the house documents, and a few memories that didn't hurt to look at. As I did this, I felt lighter. It was as if I was cleaning my soul along with the drawers. One evening, I found an old letter my husband had written years ago. It said, "Take care of yourself no matter what." I held that piece of paper for a long time. His words felt like a sign, as if he knew that someday I would need that reminder. I placed the letter in my bag, folded neatly, close to my heart. A few days later, I called a trusted agent, an old acquaintance from the neighborhood who helped sell houses. I told him quietly that I wanted to sell mine. He was surprised but didn't ask questions. He came by the next day and I showed him the papers. Everything was clear, legal, and mine. He looked at me and said, "You'll get a good price for this." I nodded. Money wasn't my goal, but I wanted closure. When the buyers came, I stayed calm and polite. They walked through the house, admiring the space, the light, the garden. I smiled faintly as they praised what I had built. They didn't know the story these walls carried, the laughter that had turned into shouting, the love that had turned into bruises. I signed the agreement quietly. No shaking hands, no tears. When the final stamp was pressed, I felt something loosen in my chest. The house was gone. The cage was open. For the next few days, I stayed as usual. I didn't tell my son or his wife. I cooked, cleaned, smiled when needed. They didn't notice the small changes: how I had started giving away old things, how I had stopped restocking groceries, how my eyes no longer searched for their approval. They thought I was aging quietly. They didn't realize I was preparing to disappear. One evening, as they were watching television, I went to my room and opened my small bag. Everything I needed was inside: my clothes, my documents, my money, and my memories. I looked around one last time. There was nothing left that belonged to me except myself, and that was enough. The next morning before dawn, I left. The streets were empty. The sky was pale and quiet. I didn't leave a note. I didn't wake them. I didn't need to explain. By the time they would rise, the house would no longer be theirs, and I would no longer be there to explain why. The papers would tell them everything. I didn't cry as I walked away. I didn't feel fear or guilt. I only felt peace, the kind that comes when you finally take control of your own story. The world was wide again, and I was free. And though I left without a sound, my silence would echo in that house for the rest of their lives. The morning I left, the air felt different, soft, cool, and quiet, like the world had paused for me. The first light of dawn slipped through the cracks in the curtains, touching the floor in golden lines. I stood by the window for a while, watching the sky turn from black to blue, feeling my heart beat in calm rhythm. For once, there was no rush, no duty, no fear, only decision. The kind that doesn't ask for permission. The house was still asleep. My son's door was shut. His wife's breathing was faint and steady from behind the wall. Even the child's small room was silent. I had memorized those sounds, every creak, every rhythm, from years of living with them. It was strange to think that soon they would be the past. I walked to the small mirror on my dresser and looked at myself one last time. My hair was streaked with gray, my face lined with years of love and exhaustion. The bruises had healed, but the memories hadn't. Still, I didn't see a victim staring back. I saw a woman who had survived everything meant to destroy her. My reflection didn't tremble anymore. My hands didn't shake. The fear that had once lived in my bones was gone. I picked up my bag, the same small cloth bag I had packed days earlier. Inside was everything I truly owned. A few clothes, some money, the property papers, my husband's old watch, and a single photograph of my son as a child. I looked at that photo for a long time. He was smiling, missing a tooth, eyes bright with innocence. I touched the edges gently and whispered a small goodbye, not to the man he had become, but to the boy who had once loved me. Then I placed the photo back in the bag and zipped it shut. I didn't leave a note. Words would have been wasted. They wouldn't have understood them, and I didn't owe them explanations. The papers in my drawer, signed, sealed, final, would speak louder than any sentence I could write. I had spent too many years explaining myself. Now I preferred silence. When I stepped into the hallway, the cold tiles met my bare feet. The air smelled faintly of the previous night's dinner, now stale and heavy. I glanced at the living room, the couch where I had once held my sleeping grandson, the table where I used to serve food, the corner where my son had shouted at me. It all looked ordinary. But it wasn't. Every piece of furniture carried a ghost of something I no longer wanted to carry. I walked to the kitchen and touched the counter where I used to prepare meals. My hands brushed against the edge of the stove. Smooth, cold, familiar. For years, I had stood there cooking for others, never for myself. I smiled faintly and turned away. That kitchen no longer held me prisoner. It had been my temple and my cage. Now, it was neither. The keys were hanging by the door. House, gate, car. I took one last look at them and smiled. I didn't need them anymore. They were symbols of control, of belonging, of access. But now I belonged to nothing and no one. I left the keys where they were, knowing soon he would find them useless. As I opened the front door, the early morning air touched my face gently. It was cool and clean, unlike the stale silence I was leaving behind. I stepped outside, pulling my shawl tighter around my shoulders. The world felt larger than it had in years. I could hear the distant sound of birds, the rustle of leaves, the far-off bark of a dog. It was strange how the world could sound so alive when you decide to start living again. I walked slowly down the road, each step careful, deliberate. The sky was beginning to lighten, soft streaks of pink and orange painting the horizon. I didn't look back. I knew that if I did, even for a second, the memories might pull me back. The guilt, the longing, the illusion of family, I couldn't afford that. This was not a moment for weakness. This was freedom, and freedom demands you walk forward. As I passed the corner of the street, the temple bell rang. Its sound echoed through the stillness, steady and grounding. I stopped for a moment and closed my eyes. I whispered a small prayer, not for them, but for myself. I prayed for peace, for forgiveness, for the years I had lost, for the courage to build a life that no one could take from me again. When I reached the bus stop, an old man sat on the bench, reading a newspaper. He nodded politely. I nodded back. It had been years since I had been seen by a stranger without judgment. For a brief moment, I felt human again. Not a burden, not a failure, not someone to be controlled, but simply a woman waiting for her bus. The bus arrived with a soft groan, old and dusty but reliable. I climbed in, carrying my small bag close to my chest. The seats were mostly empty. I chose one near the window. As it started moving, I looked out and watched the streets of my old life disappear behind me. The houses, the trees, the familiar corners, all fading into distance. I thought I might cry, but I didn't. My tears had dried long ago. What replaced them was something better, peace. The journey was long, but my mind was quiet. I didn't think about where I was going, only about what I was leaving behind. I wasn't running away. I was walking towards something clean, simple, honest. The kind of life that doesn't depend on being loved by the wrong people. Hours later, I reached a small town far enough to feel new. The air smelled of rain and earth. The streets were narrow, the people kind. I found a small guest house with faded paint and a kind woman at the desk. She looked at me with gentle eyes and asked if I was traveling alone. I smiled and said yes. It was the first time I had said that word without shame. She showed me to a small room, one bed, one window, one table. It was perfect. I placed my bag on the floor and sat on the edge of the bed. The mattress creaked, but it felt like heaven. The silence here wasn't heavy. It was peaceful. I could hear birds outside, distant laughter, the hum of life carrying on. I opened the window and a soft breeze filled the room. It smelled like beginning. That evening, I walked to the nearby market. The vendors smiled, the children ran around freely, and no one looked at me as if I didn't belong. I bought some vegetables, a small pot, and a packet of tea. When I returned to my room, I cooked a simple meal. Rice, lentils, and one small vegetable curry. It tasted better than anything I had eaten in years, not because of the food, but because it was made in peace. That night, I lay in bed, the property papers safely under my pillow. I imagined my son waking up to find the house empty. I pictured him searching for me, calling my name, finding the documents in the drawer. I wondered what his face would look like when he realized that the house he once called his was gone, sold, legally and completely. I didn't feel revenge. I felt justice. Not loud or cruel, but quiet and final. I thought of him one last time before I slept. I didn't wish him harm. I only hoped that one day, when he looked at his reflection, he would see what he had become. A man who struck his mother and lost everything that mattered. Maybe then he would understand. Maybe not. It didn't matter anymore. For the first time in decades, I slept without fear, without waiting for someone's voice, without needing permission to exist. My sleep was deep and dreamless, like a river that had finally reached the sea. I had vanished, not to disappear, but to begin again. After leaving that house, I began a new life, not the kind filled with noise and people, but the kind that breathes quietly. For years, I had lived surrounded by voices, yet I was unseen. Now, in this small rented room with plain white walls and one window, I finally saw myself again. The silence that used to frighten me had become my comfort. It was not the silence of neglect anymore. It was the silence of peace. The mornings here began differently. I would wake before sunrise and listen to the world waking with me. The sound of a rooster from far away, the gentle sweep of a broom from a neighbor's porch, the soft ringing of temple bells. Every sound was a reminder that life continues no matter what we lose. I would make tea slowly, letting the aroma fill the room. No one shouted, no one rushed. I sipped my tea in quiet gratitude, feeling alive in a way I hadn't in decades. I rented a small place on the edge of town, away from noise and eyes that pry. The landlord was an old woman who asked no questions. She smiled when I handed her the rent and said only, "Peace is better than comfort." I nodded, understanding her more than she knew. The room was small but clean. The bed was low and hard, but it carried no memories. The kitchen was barely big enough for one, but it was mine. Every corner of that place was honest. I cooked my meals in silence. Sometimes rice, sometimes a small curry with vegetables I bought fresh from the market. I didn't need much. Food tasted different when it wasn't cooked out of duty. It wasn't to please anyone, to prove love, to fill another's plate. It was cooked simply to live. And living, I learned, was more than surviving. At first, the nights were strange. I would lie in bed and feel the emptiness around me. No footsteps, no arguments, no doors slamming, only the sound of my own breathing. Sometimes I would wake up suddenly, half expecting to hear his voice calling, half fearing it, but there was nothing. Slowly, that nothing became soothing. I would light a small lamp, read an old book, or look out the window until sleep came. Days turned into weeks, and I began to meet people, ordinary people with kind hearts. The woman next door would share flowers from her garden. The shopkeeper would ask if I needed anything. A group of elderly women met every evening near the temple to talk about their lives. They laughed softly, told stories, and invited me to join. The first few times I only listened. Their laughter sounded like music after years of silence. One day I told them a small version of my story. I didn't give details, just said that I had left a place where love had died. They didn't ask for more. One of them touched my hand and said, "Sometimes we must leave to stay alive." I smiled. It was the first time in a long while that someone understood me without judgment. I began helping at the small temple nearby. I cleaned the floors, lit lamps, and handed water to visitors. No one asked who I was. No one cared what I had left behind. They just smiled and said thank you. That was enough. Every lamp I lit felt like a prayer for my own healing. I wasn't praying for him anymore. I was praying for myself, for strength, for forgiveness, for peace. I also found work, small but steady. I helped a local woman pack homemade pickles and sweets to sell in the market. The pay was little, but it gave me purpose. My hands, once used only for giving, were now creating again. I enjoyed the rhythm, chop, stir, seal, repeat. Work became therapy. With every jar I packed, I sealed away another memory of pain. On Sundays, I walked to the river nearby. I would sit on a stone under a tree and watch the water move. It flowed endlessly, carrying leaves, dust, flowers, everything it touched. It took away without complaint. I envied it, but I also admired it. The river didn't cling to what hurt it. It just moved forward quietly, gracefully. I began to learn from it. I told myself, be like water. Never stop, never look back. Months passed and life began to feel light again. I had fewer things, fewer people, fewer expectations, but more peace. I no longer lived for anyone's approval. I didn't measure my worth by how much I gave. I measured it by how much I could smile again. Sometimes in the quiet evenings, I thought of him, not with hate, but with distance. I wondered what he was doing, whether he ever missed me, whether guilt had touched his heart, but I never wished to know. Some truths don't heal, they reopen wounds. I had left that chapter closed, and it was better that way. I also thought about my grandson, the one whose laughter once filled my days. I missed him sometimes. He was too young to understand what had happened. Maybe one day, when he grows up, he'll search for me. Maybe he won't. Either way, I prayed he would learn kindness before pride. I prayed he would never raise his hand on the woman who gave him life. With time, I realized that love doesn't always end in hate. Sometimes it ends in silence. Sometimes it simply changes shape. I still loved my son, not the man he became, but the child he once was. But now that love lived quietly inside me without pain, it was a scar, not a wound. It didn't ache anymore. Every evening I would light a lamp in my small room, not for anyone else, but for myself. The soft glow filled the space with warmth. It reminded me that light doesn't need witnesses to exist. I had lived in darkness long enough to understand that true light comes from within. One day, while walking through the market, I passed a jewelry shop. In the window, I saw a silver bracelet. Simple, thin, shining softly under the light. I walked in and bought it. When I wore it, the cool metal against my wrist felt like freedom. It wasn't expensive, but it was mine. For years, everything I owned had belonged to someone else. My time, my body, my silence. Now even this small piece of silver felt sacred. The landlord's daughter sometimes visited me. She brought her school books and sat near my chair, asking for help with reading. I helped her with joy. When she read aloud, I listened as if the sound itself was healing. Her voice reminded me that life always continues, that innocence still exists somewhere. There were moments of loneliness too. On festival days, I missed having people around. When the world outside lit up with lamps and laughter, I sometimes felt the old ache return, the ache of belonging. But it never lasted long. I would remind myself that peace is better than noise, that self-respect is better than forced company. I would light one lamp for the family I lost and another for the woman I became. Seasons changed. Summer heat, monsoon rains, winter winds. Each season left its mark on my little room. I grew older, but lighter. My heart no longer carried the weight of what could have been. It carried only gratitude for what still was. I began to write small notes in a notebook. Not letters, not stories, just thoughts, things I had learned too late. I wrote, "You can love your children and still leave them." I wrote, "A mother's heart is not an endless well." I wrote, "Peace is not found in forgiveness alone. Sometimes it's found in distance." That notebook became my quiet friend. I kept it by my bedside, along with my husband's watch. Time moved differently now, slower, softer, kinder. One morning as the sun rose, I looked around my room and realized something simple but powerful. I was free, completely. No one could shout at me, no one could strike me, no one could decide my worth. My life belonged to me again, even in its smallest form. That was all I ever wanted. Time has a strange way of healing you, not by erasing the pain, but by helping you see it differently. Months passed since I left, and the woman I was back then, bruised, small, afraid, was gone. I had grown into someone I didn't recognize at first. A woman with steady hands, peaceful eyes, and a spine made of quiet strength. People often say courage comes from loud actions, from shouting, from fighting. But I learned that the truest courage comes in silence, in the choice to walk away and never look back. I didn't live a grand life after leaving. I didn't buy a new house or start some remarkable adventure. I lived simply, In a small room with peeling paint near a temple and a row of markets, my bed creaked, the fan buzzed, and the nights were often long. But every sound, every flaw felt honest. There were no slammed doors, no cruel words, no fear of being unwanted. That kind of peace was new to me. It wasn't given by anyone. It was built by my own decision. Every morning I woke before sunrise and sat by my window with a cup of tea. The world outside was small, a narrow street, a few trees, the sound of people sweeping, birds calling, life beginning again. I realized then that peace doesn't always come from great change. Sometimes it comes from stillness, from breathing without waiting for the next wound. I started to take care of myself, slowly, awkwardly, like a child learning how to live again. I walked to the market every week, greeted the shopkeepers by name, bought fresh vegetables, and talked to the children who played nearby. They laughed easily, without cruelty, and reminded me that innocence still existed in the world. I was invisible for so long that even these small connections felt sacred. At first I carried guilt, not for leaving, but for surviving. A part of me kept asking if I had done the right thing. Was it wrong to sell the house? Was it wrong to vanish without a word? But then I would remember the night he raised his hand, the silence that followed, the eyes that looked at me without love, and I would remind myself that what I did wasn't wrong. It was necessary. I didn't take revenge. I reclaimed respect. I didn't destroy his life. I saved my own. That thought became my prayer. Sometimes people from my old neighborhood passed by the temple and recognized me. They would stop, surprised, and ask where I had been. I always smiled softly and said, I found a quieter life. Some tried to ask more, but I never told the full story. Not because I was ashamed, but because I didn't want pity. My story wasn't about suffering anymore. It was about strength. One afternoon, while helping clean the temple courtyard, an old man said to me, "You look peaceful." It was such a simple sentence, but it touched me deeply. I hadn't heard anyone say that in years. For so long, people saw me as tired, as broken, as someone to pity. Now, someone saw peace on my face, and it was real. In the evenings, I still thought of my son sometimes. Memory is not something you can turn off. I would wonder how he was living now, whether he understood what he had done. I didn't wish him harm, but I didn't wish him comfort either. I hoped that every time he walked into that house, now owned by strangers, he would feel the emptiness of what he had lost. Not the house itself, but the heart that had once made it a home. I learned something powerful in those months, that motherhood doesn't mean surrender. I used to think a mother's love had no limits, that it was noble to endure everything. But endurance without respect is not love. It is self-erasure, and no woman, no mother, should have to disappear for someone else's comfort. When I looked back at my life, I saw decades of giving, forgiving, and waiting. But I also saw the moment that changed everything. When I finally chose myself. That decision didn't make me cruel. It made me whole. I realized that the world often romanticizes sacrifice but rarely honors survival. People tell mothers to stay, to forgive, to be patient, even when it kills their spirit. No one tells them that walking away can also be love. Love for themselves. I began writing again in my small notebook. This time, I didn't write about pain. I wrote about lessons. I wrote, love must never be louder than respect. I wrote, kindness given to the wrong people becomes permission for cruelty. And I wrote, the day I left, I didn't lose my son. I found myself. Those words became my prayer, my promise to every woman who ever felt small in her own home. Sometimes the world doesn't change. You have to step outside it to find peace. I also began visiting a local school to help children learn to read. It started by accident. One day, a teacher asked if I could volunteer. I said yes. The first time I sat with the children, I felt alive again. Their curiosity, their laughter, their innocence reminded me that not all love hurts. They would bring me flowers, drawings, small things that meant the world to me. I never told them my story, but I think they felt it. The way I listened to them, the way I encouraged them to speak gently, the way I smiled when they called me Dadi. That word, spoken with love, healed something in me. With every passing month, my loneliness became lighter. I learned to fill my days with meaning, not memories. I learned that peace isn't the absence of pain. It's the ability to live alongside it without letting it define you. Sometimes I would sit near the river again, watching the water flow endlessly. I thought about time, how it carries everything forward, whether we want it to or not. The river doesn't stop for grief, and neither should we. I realized I had spent my life trying to hold back the current, trying to keep love from drifting away. But the truth is, letting go is what allows you to float. When people hurt you, they expect you to crumble. They expect you to become bitter or broken. But strength doesn't always look like defiance. Sometimes it looks like a calm woman living quietly after being forgotten. Sometimes the greatest revenge is peace. I didn't celebrate his downfall. I didn't even follow what happened after. Maybe he moved away, maybe he tried to find me, maybe he didn't, but I stopped existing for him. That was my justice. My existence no longer revolved around his choices, his moods, his words. I had built a small, quiet universe where I mattered again. Every night before sleeping, I would light a lamp and sit in silence. I didn't pray for forgiveness. I didn't ask for blessings. I just thanked life for giving me another day. That gratitude became my strength. It reminded me that survival was victory enough. If anyone were to ask me today what I learned, I would tell them this. Strength isn't in what you endure. It's in what you refuse to accept anymore. I had once been a mother defined by sacrifice. Now I was a woman defined by self-respect. The world may never know my story, but I know it, and that's enough. As years passed, I found that the pain didn't vanish, but it softened. It turned into something almost gentle, a reminder of who I used to be and how far I had come. Sometimes, when I looked at the sky in the evenings, I thought about forgiveness. I wondered if I had forgiven him. The truth is, I didn't know. But I had forgiven myself for staying too long, for believing too much, for hoping too hard, and that was enough. I learned to live without needing closure. Some stories don't end with apologies, they end with peace. Mine did. And in that peace, I found a strength that no one could ever take from me again. Years have passed since that day, and I have grown old in a way that feels lighter. My hair is silver now, my hands thinner, my steps slower, but my heart is calm. I no longer carry the noise of the past. It doesn't haunt me the way it used to. Time has softened the edges of every memory, turning even the sharpest moments into quiet lessons. The wounds that once bled now rest as faint marks, reminders of where I have been, not chains that keep me there. Some mornings I wake before sunrise and sit by the window of my little room. The same street outside still wakes the way it always did, with the sound of brooms sweeping, temple bells ringing, and children laughing in the distance. I watch the light fill the room and I think of how far I have come. I no longer ask myself why it happened. That question no longer matters. What matters is that I survived, that I rebuilt myself from nothing but silence and courage. I used to believe that motherhood was meant to last forever. That no matter what happens, a mother must forgive, must return, must stay. But I learned that staying in pain is not loyalty. It's self-destruction. I had mistaken endurance for strength, forgiveness for love, and silence for peace. Now I know better. A mother's love should never require her to forget her own worth. Sometimes when I pass by families in the market, mothers walking with their sons, hands joined, I smile. I no longer envy them. I simply hope they are kind to one another. I hope that child grows up remembering the softness that raised him, and I hope that woman never forgets herself in the act of giving. Love can be beautiful when it's not one-sided. I've also learned to forgive in my own way, not through words, not through reunion, but through release. Forgiveness, for me, doesn't mean pretending it never happened. It means I stopped letting it define me. I forgave him not because he deserved it, but because I deserved peace. Hate would have tied me to him forever, and I had already spent a lifetime bound to him. I needed to be free, truly free. I never heard from him again. Not a letter, not a call, not a word. Maybe shame kept him away, maybe pride, or maybe he simply never thought of me again. There was a time that thought would have broken me. Now, it doesn't. His silence is not my punishment anymore, it's his. Sometimes, late at night, I look at the old photograph I still keep in my bag, the one of him as a child. I don't see the man who raised his hand on me. I see the boy who once clung to my sari, who fell asleep in my lap. I smile at that boy because he's still somewhere inside the man he became. Lost, unreachable, but real once. I don't cry anymore when I look at that photo. I only whisper a small prayer that he finds the humanity he lost, even if it's too late for us. My neighbors often ask me why I live alone. I tell them, because peace needs space. They laugh softly, but I mean every word. I've learned that solitude isn't emptiness. It's clarity. It's the quiet where you meet yourself again. In my younger years, I was surrounded by people but always lonely. Now, in my solitude, I feel full. I've filled my days with small routines, tending to a few plants, helping children read at the temple school, writing short thoughts in my notebook. I don't plan big things anymore. I just live simply, fully, gently. The world doesn't owe me joy, but I find it in small places. In a warm cup of tea, in the laughter of a child, in the kindness of a stranger. Every now and then I dream of the house I sold. In my dreams, it's empty. The walls echo with silence. The garden is overgrown. The lights dim. I don't wake with sadness. I wake with understanding. That house wasn't my loss. It was my freedom. I built it with love, but love cannot live where respect has died. Selling it was not destruction. It was closure. People often ask me what keeps me going. The answer is simple. Peace. Peace that I fought for quietly. Peace that I earned. It's not loud or bright. It's soft and like a steady heartbeat reminding me that I'm still here, still living, still whole. Sometimes I wonder what my husband would say if he could see me now. I think he would be proud. Not because I was strong, but because I chose dignity when the world expected silence. He used to tell me, "You are the root of this family." And for a long time, I believed that meant I must stay no matter how much it hurt. But now I know that even roots can move. They can leave dead soil and start again somewhere new. I am old now, but not bitter. Bitterness is a poison that lives in those who still want revenge. I don't want revenge. I want rest. I have it now. My days are simple, my nights are calm, and my soul is unburdened. That is enough. When I tell my story now, I don't raise my voice, I don't cry, I speak softly because peace doesn't shout. I tell it not to hurt anyone, but to remind others, especially mothers, but especially women, that silence can be broken, that love should never hurt, that respect is the only thing that makes love real. If my story reaches even one woman sitting in her room tonight, hiding her pain, believing she has no way out, I hope she hears me when I say you do. You can leave. You can start again. You can choose peace, even if it means walking away from those you once lived for. I've learned that love is not proven by staying. Sometimes it's proven by leaving, because leaving means you believe in yourself enough to protect your spirit. Now, when I close my eyes at night, I think of all the women before me, the ones who stayed, who broke quietly, who were never heard. I think of them and I whisper, I made it out. For them, for me, for every mother who ever forgot her own name in the act of love. My story isn't about revenge, it's about return, not to a person, but to myself. I didn't run away, I came home. To my own soul, to my own peace, to my own worth. Sometimes I still forget things. I forget small details, the names of places, the dates of festivals, the time of day, but one thing I will never forget again is who I am. I am not the woman who begged to be seen. I am not the mother who was struck and silenced. I am the woman who sold her pain, her house, her past, and bought her freedom. I don't need the world to remember me. I only need to know that I lived my truth. That is my legacy. He slapped me 15 times because I forgot his name, but I remembered mine. And that memory, that small, quiet truth, will outlive everything else.